I trusted my family with everything. Then I found one secret that changed my life forever. I never thought my own sister would betray me. My name is Nituna Fireheart, and I am a wildlife photographer. I worked hard for every dream I had. I never knew my biggest enemy was living inside my own family. I believed my family always wanted the best for me, a conviction rooted in years of shared laughter, holiday dinners, and the quiet comfort of unconditional support. Growing up, my parents had cultivated an atmosphere of absolute loyalty, where the outside world was meant to be faced as a united front. My sister, Clara, was the centerpiece of this stability, an architect by trade who seemed to build our family's happiness as meticulously as she drafted blueprints for high-end homes. I admired her without question, often turning to her for advice on everything from my career in photography to the complexities of personal relationships. She possessed a grounded wisdom that I constantly craved, acting as the stabilizer whenever my career took me into the unpredictable wilderness. However, I began to notice small things that suddenly felt strange: a misplaced file, a guarded look when I mentioned my finances, and a certain tightness in her voice whenever I asked about the inheritance money my parents had entrusted her to manage for us. I ignored these growing doubts for months, pushing them aside because I loved her too much to entertain the thought of malice. I convinced myself that the stress of her profession was simply bleeding into her personal life, unaware that the foundation of my trust was already beginning to erode. I found something that did not belong buried deep in a drawer in the home office where Clara managed our family's trust. It was an envelope containing bank statements for an account I didn't recognize, accounts that showed thousands of dollars being funneled away from our joint property holdings into a private firm based overseas. I tried to explain it away, pacing the small room as I told myself it must be a business expense for one of her architecture projects, perhaps a tax shelter or a silent investment. But the math didn't add up, and the dates coincided perfectly with times I was out on assignment in the backcountry, disconnected from the grid. I quietly watched everyone's reactions during the next family dinner, observing how Clara's hands trembled slightly when my father mentioned the progress of the property sales. She laughed too loudly and changed the subject with a practiced ease that, for the first time, struck me as hollow. I realized then that someone was hiding the truth from me, and the cold realization began to sink into my bones, replacing the warmth of family dinners with a biting, persistent chill. I remembered old events differently, scrubbing through my memories like a film reel to find the inconsistencies I had previously overlooked. There was the time 3 years ago when she insisted our childhood home had to be sold quickly to cover taxes, a sale that left me with far less than I expected, and the way she had discouraged me from hiring an independent auditor. I noticed every lie had a pattern, a careful architecture of half-truths designed to keep me perpetually uninformed and reliant on her expertise. I followed these threads quietly, checking online records from my laptop during late nights in my hotel rooms, mapping out the flow of money without telling anyone. I feared the answer would break my heart, but the evidence was mounting, painting a picture of calculated theft that was impossible to ignore. Every time I looked at a photo of us together, I no longer saw a supportive sister. I saw a person who had spent years systematically dismantling my financial security while holding my hand and telling me everything was going to be just fine. I uncovered the ultimate proof against my own sister, a series of digital signatures on property transfer documents that were clearly forged to give her sole power of attorney over my portion of the estate. The sheer scope of the betrayal left me breathless, standing in my dimly lit living room as the weight of it crushed my lungs. I felt shocked, angry, and so deeply hurt that I struggled to physically stand. It wasn't just the money. It was the years of fake encouragement, the way she had praised my photography while secretly profiting from the assets that were supposed to sustain my future. I kept my discovery a secret, carefully copying the files to an encrypted drive and hiding the original documents back where I had found them. I decided I had to learn everything before acting, knowing that if I confronted her now, she would have enough time to delete the trails and cover her tracks forever. I needed to be the one to hold the cards this time. I pretended nothing had changed, forcing myself to endure the familiar routine of Sunday brunches and weekly phone calls. I watched every move she made, noticing the nervous flickers in her eyes when I asked casual questions about the estate's performance. The mask she wore, the perfect, responsible sister, seemed to crack slightly under my scrutiny, though she remained unaware that I was looking at her differently. As I dug deeper, I gained more hidden information from public records, discovering that she had used my money to bail out her failing architecture firm and to fund a lifestyle I never knew she was struggling to maintain. I realized the betrayal was even bigger than I had first imagined. She hadn't just stolen money, she had actively sabotaged potential career opportunities for me in my field, fearing that if I became too successful, I would eventually hire a private accountant who would expose her. The realization left me numb, yet it provided a strange kind of clarity that fueled my resolve. I learned how long the lies had lasted, realizing they spanned nearly 6 years, beginning right after our mother passed away when I was most vulnerable. I understood why my life had felt like a series of missed connections and stalled projects. She had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, creating just enough friction to keep me dependent on her help. I struggled to stay calm during our meetings, my hands fisted in my pockets as she spoke about our future with a sickeningly sweet tone. I promised myself I would not stay silent, regardless of the fallout. I realized that my silence was her greatest weapon, and I was finished being a casualty in her game of greed. The pain was still there, a jagged piece of glass in my chest, but I turned that pain into a cold, focused energy that kept me moving forward. I planned every move with care, consulting with a legal expert I had kept anonymous from the rest of the family. I refused to let my raw, boiling anger control me. If I lashed out, she would gain the upper hand by playing the victim, casting me as the unstable, irrational artist. I prepared for the truth to come out, knowing that this would essentially destroy the image of the family I had spent my entire life trying to protect. I accepted that my family would never be the same again. The illusion of the perfect home was already dead, and there was no point in trying to perform a resurrection. I began to distance myself from our shared accounts, ensuring that my future earnings from my photography projects were safely tucked away in an account she couldn't touch. I was meticulously building a new life even as I stood in the wreckage of the old one. I gathered the bank statements, forged signatures, and email exchanges, organizing them into a chronological report that laid out the entire history of her deception. I trusted one loyal friend, a former colleague who was a forensic accountant, to verify every detail before I took the next step. We checked and double-checked the math, confirming the exact amounts and the destination of the diverted funds. Every detail had to be bulletproof. There could be no room for her to spin a tale of misunderstanding. I created a clear, systematic plan to expose the betrayal during a scheduled family mediation meeting, a setting where my father would be present and unable to look away from the truth. The preparation was grueling, requiring me to look at the worst parts of my life repeatedly, but it was necessary. I faced my sister in the quiet study of our family home, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. My father sat at the head of the table, his face etched with confusion as I placed the folder before him. I didn't raise my voice, I simply laid out the evidence, piece by piece, document by document. When Clara started to interrupt with panicked denials, I didn't shout. I just presented the next bank record, the next forged signature, and the next proof of her lies. I watched the color drain from her face as she tried to argue, her voice cracking when I produced the emails where she bragged to her business partner about how easy it was to manipulate my finances. The lies didn't fall apart in a grand explosion, they dissolved into the silence of the room, leaving her exposed and small. My father stared at the papers, his hands shaking as he read through the evidence that his golden child had been stealing from her own blood for years. He looked at her, his eyes cold and distant, and asked her how she could have done it. She couldn't answer, her pride failing her when faced with the undeniable reality of her own greed. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift and final. Because the evidence was so overwhelming and involved clear cases of forgery, the bank opened an investigation that led to Clara's immediate termination from her firm and a massive lawsuit that forced her to sell her primary assets, effectively stripping her of the wealth she had stolen and the status she had built on a foundation of lies. My father, in a moment of agonizing clarity, sat with me the following week and apologized for his blindness, then took the pen and signed a document that permanently removed Clara from any role in our family's estate or business matters, cutting her off completely. I stood on the porch of the home I had finally reclaimed, watching the autumn leaves drift across the lawn. I felt a profound sense of emptiness, but for the first time in years, it was a clean, quiet emptiness rather than a heavy burden. I picked up my camera bag, the weight of the strap familiar and comforting against my shoulder. I was leaving for a remote assignment the next morning, but this time, the journey wasn't an escape from a trap. It was the first step into a life where every sunrise belonged only to me. I walked down the path, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, and took a long, steady breath of the cool air. "I am ready,"